So the lower age limit of 12 was done away with altogether, and they moved to what they call a stage rather than age approach. And this meant that, as provided a young person had actually started puberty, that they were in the very early stages, something called Tanner stage 2, they could potentially be eligible. And anybody could take part and not be part of a research study. And really it was very striking, having set out to do the right thing and then not wait for your data.
Right. But also, did they have the same criteria as the Dutch, which is that they had to make sure these children had no other factors affecting them, family issues?
Well, this is the other thing that majorly changed. So during the study, the criteria were largely the same as the Dutch, although some clinicians say it was a little bit grey in practice, but they were largely the same. But what happened then was that, as we've seen in gender clinics across the Western world, not only did the absolute numbers being referred increase rapidly, but there was a dramatic shift in the demographics of the young people being referred as well. So there was a shift from natal boys, largely. There have always been girls, but largely it was a higher proportion of boys. We saw this shift to a majority of girls who didn't have lifelong gender dysphoria or gender incongruence, but actually their gender difficulties had started after the onset of puberty in adolescence, and many of whom were contending with quite serious associated difficulties, things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders. They'd had quite traumatic backgrounds, many of them. And so directly not meeting the criteria of the Dutch study, which at that point, and really still is, the only major evidence for this intervention. But GIDS openly put those people onto puberty blockers as well, or referred them on. And the director of the service and one of her leadership team were open about this in Parliament in 2015. They said, we have extended the early blocking of puberty for those for whom there isn't a robust evidence base, because we think it can be a benefit to people if we carefully extend it. And really that's when people started to worry, because they're saying the evidence base was limited anyway, and we're now applying it to a completely different cohort of people who clearly have a lot of other things going on as well.
Because children age 3 or 4 that suddenly start identifying each other's sex continue to do that through their childhood, then have extreme anxiety around puberty, is one group of kids. Then there's another group who have been fuzzy, fine, or whatever, just not had an issue at all. And they're overwhelmingly girls now, not boys. And they hit puberty, and that's when the gender dysphoria starts to arise in a very now.
And in some cases,
we'll go through the numbers. Let's go through the numbers, because it was up within 10 years. We went from some crazy 1,000% increase, but it's roughly about like 9 or 10 to start with, right? That's the very earliest, and then it goes up to several thousand.
Yeah, I mean, in the first sort of decade, I mean, really, you could count on 2 hands how many were referred, and then we get to 2009 and 97 are referred, so still relatively small. Bearing in mind that's a national gender clinic, there was no other one.
Right.
And then from 2009, we saw this increase of 50% per annum. So about 150 the year later, 225, roughly 50% until we get to 2015 and it doubles. And you got 1,450-ish referrals that year. And so we go from the tens to the thousands in the space of 5-6 years.